We're using a self-processing form and have added error messages that will be displayed if there are errors or required fields have been left blank. Let's start building the processing script by making sure required fields are filled in. I've opened contact.php in the chapter 9 09_03 begin folder of the exercise files. In the PHP block above the doctype declaration, we need to create a conditional statement that will execute code only when the form has been submitted. And if we scroll down to the bottom of the form, we can see that the name of the submit button is send, so that's what we need to look for. So after these two arrays have been initialized above the doctype declaration, we need to add a conditional statement, and we'll use the isSet function to see if post send has been set. If it has, we know the form has been submitted, so we'll execute the code. We need to start off with two arrays. One of them will list the names of the fields in the form, so that will be called expected. And at the moment we've got three fields: name, email and comments. The reason I'm creating this array is because even if you use JavaScript to validate user input in the browser, it's vital to check data submitted from an external source on the server with PHP as well. In fact, it's more important because it's trivially easy for a malicious attacker to bypass JavaScript validation. And we need this expected array because we're going to automate the way the post array is processed. And this adds to security because we'll only be processing the values that we expect and ignore any that might be injected by a potential attacker. The other array that I want to create is for the required fields, so I'll call that required. And we'll start off by having just two fields in there, name and comments. Now when processing a form, it's a good idea to put generic script in an external file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder inside the begin folder and call it includes. And then inside there, I'm going to create a page for my processing script. So that's a PHP file, and I'll call it process_mail.php. Then inside this new file, we need a for each loop to go through the post array. So we're going through the post array as key. And we also want the value, so we use the arrow operator and value. And the first thing I want to do inside the loop is to strip leading and trailing white space from the value using the trim function. This will prevent anyone from trying to skip a required field by pressing the spacebar several times. So we'll reassign the value back to value. Now currently the form's got only text input fields, but some form elements are submitted as arrays. So we'll use the ternary operator, and we'll also try to find out whether the value has been submitted as an array or not. So our condition will use the isArray function, and we pass it value to that. If it is an array, we simply reassign value back to the value variable, but otherwise we pass it to the trim function, which removes leading and trailing white space from strings. So the value is being passed to trim. Now let's pause before adding the next section of code, because I think that just looking at the code might be difficult to understand. I want to store the values of the post variables in simpler variables. The data from the three form elements will be submitted like this. Processing the data will be a lot easier if the values can be reassigned to simple variables like this. The way I'm going to do it is by using a PHP construction known as a variable variable, which creates a new variable dynamically. Let's say you've got a variable called key, and its value is name. To create a variable variable, you precede the original variable with another $sign and assign it a value. This creates a new variable that derives its name from the value of the original variable. In this case, the value of key is name, so $key creates a variable called name. So if key is email, it will create a new variable called email, and so on. So with that explanation out of the way, let's get back to the code. So we're looping through the post array, accessing both the key and the value of each array element. We've also trimmed leading and trailing white space from string values. So what we need to do is to find out if the value is empty and if the key is in the required array. So we'll do that with a conditional statement. If, then we can use the empty function, which tells you whether a variable has no value. So if empty value, and if it's in the required array, and in array we're looking for the key, that's the name of the input field, and we need to check the required array. If it is, we know we've got a required field that hasn't been filled in, so we need to add that to the missing array. So missing with an empty pair of square brackets after it, and then we assign the key, in other words the name of the form field, to it. And then we need to use a variable, so $, and key, and assign it an empty string. So this will deal with required fields that are missing. But otherwise, if the key is in the expected array, we need to assign the value to a simpler variable. So else if, and then our condition will be in array. We're looking for the key again, but this time we're looking in the expected array. And if it is, we use a variable, $, key equals value. So in both cases, a variable using the same name as the key will be created, but if a required field is blank, the value of the new variable is set to an empty string, and its key is added to the missing array. So that completes this part of this script. So let's go back to the main script in contact.php, and we need to include that. And it's an essential part of the script, so we need to use require, and we're inside the includes folder, and the file is called process_mail.php. So if we save both of those files and then load contact.php in a browser, we can now test our processing script. So if I just submit the form without inserting anything into any of the fields, we now get the error messages. Please fix the items indicated. We've got one for the name. There isn't one for email because that wasn't in the required array, but we have got one for comments. But if I now fill in something in name and submit, that one goes away, and we've still got the error message for comments. But if I fill in both name, so David, and just a quick comment there, and submit, all the error messages go away. So the processing script is beginning to take shape. There is a lot more to do with the mail processing script, but by looping through the post array and checking whether required fields have been filled in, we're now able to display appropriate error messages. You've also seen how to create a variable dynamically using a technique known as a variable. Let's just switch back to the editing program and take a look at that. It's in process_mail.php. A variable is created by adding $2 in front of the variable name, and this creates a new variable that derives its name from the value of the original variable. In this case, we use the key of elements in the post array to create simplified variables and reassign their values to new variables. So post name becomes name, post email becomes email, and post comments becomes comments. This can be a difficult concept to grasp when you first encounter it, so take a moment to review this video to make sure you understand how the code works.